We're joined now by the ANC's Electoral Committee head, Kgalema Motlanthe. Dr. Motlanthe, good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time tonight.
Good evening, Kathy, and good evening to the Newzroom Afrika viewers.
Now that you've completed this step of the process, are you feeling confident about running a successful conference in the next 3 weeks?
Yes, certainly. Thus far, we haven't encountered any difficulties. 89% of the branches in good standing participated in this process of nominating the candidates for leadership positions.
Mm-hmm. When you think about the elective conference, what are some of the biggest risks that you think that conference faces right now?
Well, the running of conference separate from, the electoral processes.
Fair enough.
It's really the responsibility of the leadership of the National Executive Committee. As you know, there will be a political report presented by the President on behalf of the National Executive Committee. There will also be a report on state of organization presented by the SG ordinarily. It will be presented in this case by, as we understand it, by the Deputy President, and then the financial report will be presented by the Treasurer General.
As things stand, you ended off today by talking about the fact that this nomination list, as we see it, is of course not final, because those delegates at conference will have the opportunity to raise nominations from the floor. Based on your history in this organization, how different would you say things can change during that process?
Well, it's hard to predict how things would change, but certainly the fact that, there's that window of opportunity, and in the past, members have taken advantage of that and nominated whomsoever they fancied. And then, of course, the test is that 25% of voting delegates at that conference should support that nomination. Then it would be included or added to the ballot paper.
So I suppose what I'm really asking is, what then must we read around these nominations? What does it tell us about what to expect at conference?
It's just indications of, the branch, branch memberships, inclinations as to who they believe should be supported. And that's, of course, they will mandate those they elected to, and those that they delegate their right of participation to. So that's why they are called delegates. And so the delegates, remember, in terms of the ANC Constitution, the National Elective Conference, once it is convened and the credentials are adopted, it is a structure in itself. It's a structure the same way as you have a structure called the National Executive Committee. So delegates who are mandated by branches to participate are members of that structure called the National Conference. That is why it's a conference of delegates from branches. It's not a summit of provinces.
You have been quite vocal about your views in as far as the state of the organization is concerned. How would you describe this particular conference and what it will mean for your organization, the ANC?
Well, really, like any other conference of the ANC.
Is it like any other conference?
It's a watershed conference. Because for the simple reason that you have, in this conference, for instance, remember the structures of the African National Congress now, from branches, regions, provinces, are led by younger people. Generation that went through COSAS and SASCO is now in leadership positions. And some of them are already members of the National Executive Committee as well. So in a sense, it also represents an intergenerational transition, as it were. So you are likely to see many more, younger leadership in that leadership structure.
Is it really like any other conference of the ANC, though, given the fact that you go into it mindful of some of the surveys that have been conducted, including by your own organization, that suggest that post-2024, you could be sitting below the 50% mark of the majority?
Well, that is not inevitable. It shouldn't really end up that way. And that is why this conference is a very important conference, precisely because the leadership of the ANC wants to, in a sense, improve on its performance in terms of how it relates to the electorate, the nation, and the constituency. And so that's why part of the themes are around renewal. And renewal means a surgical overhaul, basically, to ensure that the ANC is structured and organized and functions in a manner that connects it with communities here.
You've had some members of the NEC within the last couple of weeks come out to say publicly that this is the weakest the ANC has ever been, that its leadership structures, including the NEC, are the weakest and the most factionalized that it has ever been. How does that surgery take place without a complete change of individuals?
Well, that's why this structure called National Conference is a structure of delegates from branches. It's not the National Executive Committee. In fact, 90% of the voting delegates come from branches. And they are the ones who are the organization. When we speak of the National Executive Committee, it is actually an elected structure of leadership. Whereas the membership, the organization, is the general membership. And 90% of the voting delegates would be representing the general membership. And in the past, Kathy, if you go through the resolutions of ANC conferences, you find that they speak to critical issues that affect, the people and the general membership. In other words, even the establishment of the electoral committee was in response, actually, to the identification of manipulation of internal democratic processes, as well as usage of money to influence thinking and outcomes of meetings and conferences. So that's why in the resolution they said we need to establish an electoral committee that must propose rules to the National Executive Committee. That's what happened. So now those rules are being applied for the first time.
That acknowledgement says to me very much that it then means that it is the branches themselves that are factionalized. It is the branches themselves that are involved in this vote buying that you have been speaking about, the use of money effectively to steer conference resolution, conference decisions in a particular way. How do you root that out without effectively tearing the ANC down the middle? Is it even possible at this point to do that?
It is possible to do that. That is why, as I said, On the one hand, you have the same delegates resolving against what they see as erosion of, ANC values, and the same delegates electing leadership that is going to be caught by these resolutions, the implementation of these resolutions. So you then end up with some in the leadership even saying, where does this, this step aside rule and so on? But it's a reflection of the thinking of the membership at that time, because they're concerned about corruption, they're concerned about manipulation of processes, and so they resolve that this is what we need to do in order to eliminate these kinds of practices. And when it comes to voting, if they vote according to slates, of course, they will end up with leaders who will fall foul of these resolutions, if you know what I mean.
Is that not the biggest challenge that the ANC is facing right now? That people are voting along the lines of slates, as we have seen in previous conferences?
Well, this time round, the slates won't work.
Why?
They haven't worked, even with regard to these nominations. And I'm sure by the time the elections happen, the voting takes place at conference, you will have a completely different outcome.
Why do you believe things will be different this time around?
Well, the nominations haven't followed any slate. In fact, they started at branch level. That's why you've had so-called pronouncements happening that, we support so-and-so, we want this name, and so on, by provincial leaders. But the branches in their nominations as consolidated have produced different outcomes.
We'll continue the conversation in a moment. You've been speaking a lot about the fact that the ANC needs to be mindful of who it is speaking to, not just ANC members, but people who vote for the ANC at election time. And of course, there are big issues that the electorate has been raising. And we continue our conversation with the ANC's Electoral Committee head, Kgalema Motlanthe. You've raised the need for the delegates, and not even the delegates at conference, but just for the ANC as a whole, to be mindful of the issues that South Africans are talking about. Corruption, of course, is a big issue. I look at this nomination list that you have released today of the top 6, and we can narrow it down just to the top 2. So you have President Cyril Ramaphosa, currently embroiled in the controversy of Phala Phala. You have Zweli Mkhize, who is his, opponent there. And he, of course, is still dealing with the scandal around PPE corruption. Both these individuals are who the branches have said they want to stand for the position of president. Is that renewal?
Well, this is a process of nomination by more than 300,000, more than 3,000 branches. So, in a sense, in their wisdom, because this is a consolidated outcome, they believe that these are the nominees who will provide leadership to the ANC. Now, I must say to you, Kathy, that in the guidelines, in the rules that the NEC adopted, there's a section that outlines the importance of this structure called the National Executive Committee and its role and functions. And that section was to be read at the BGM, the Branch General Members Meeting, to remind members that this is a very important structure. It's going to be the face and voice of the ANC for the next 5 years. And that, therefore, you know, they should nominate and aim to elect people who will inspire confidence, not just to the card-carrying members of the ANC, but to the plus 12 million South Africans who vote for the ANC, as well as the general populace. Because if they just nominate for the sake of it, then you know, they will at the end be settled with the leadership they deserve. So that section is a reminder to the general membership that the task of nominating and electing leadership for the, to serve in the National Executive Committee is a very important task, and they should apply their minds very carefully in doing so.
If South Africans have called for an ANC that breaks with corruption, does it help the party to have leaders that are embroiled in scandal around some of those very issues nominated to high positions in the organization?
Well, as I said, that's the sentiment of the general membership.
What's your sentiment? As
consolidated, the issues around the, you know, the two comrades are issues that are going to be concluded one way or the other, sooner rather than later. And so at that point, the views of the general membership, the assumption is that these comrades would be cleared of all allegations against them.
Do you think that this is going to help the ANC win back its electoral fortunes?
Well, as I said, the rules, the section that deals with how the members should approach the nominations, state very clearly that they should aim to nominate for election leaders who will inspire confidence, you know, of not just the electorate but the general populace.
So I'm
because the prestige and standing of the ANC is basically embodied by those who would be in the National Executive Committee.
So what I'm asking is, do you think, based on what you are seeing now, that the decisions that are being made by the branches around this issue will lead to exactly that? The regaining of that trust among South Africans, the commitment of the ANC to renewing itself. Is this list a reflection of an ANC that is doing that surgery that you spoke about?
Well, this is the starting point, and sorry, sorry, and we hope that the leadership collective at the end would be a leadership collective that would be equal to the challenges not only of the ANC but of the country as a whole.
What do you think the biggest risk is currently, particularly in as far as the president is concerned? You've spoken openly about the fact that he didn't confide in the NEC about the Phala Phala saga. Last I checked, he still hadn't really taken the body into its confidence, into his confidence rather.
Well, that's water under the bridge now, because the line of march from the National Executive Committee is that we must all wait for the parliamentary panel to present its report, and whatever it says, we will then take guidance from that.
Does it not create an impression of a president that is unaccountable to his own organization?
Well, he's the head, he's the political head of the ANC. And, that's how he's elected to manage this issue. And the NEC, in its wisdom, says to all of us, please wait for the panel to submit its report, and we'll hear what the report says.
Does that mean he's untouchable, that the ANC can't hold him accountable?
The National Executive Committee?
Yes.
Well, I'm not a member of the National Executive Committee, so I'm not in a position to, make any
you are
fair, objective
a
assessment.
stalwart of the ANC. You've been with this movement for a very long time. And on this issue, where you have a president that is facing these allegations, is it correct that you have this picture of him that emerges as somebody who is simply not held accountable? Does that sit right with you?
Well, the presidents of the ANC are as good as the team they lead at any given time. So it speaks not only of the president, it also speaks of the National Executive Committee in its entirety.
Do you think they've made the right decision?
Well, that's a decision they've made. We respect it.
Is it the right decision, though?
We can only respect it. I have my own views, but,
What are your views?
Those are private views, of a private member of the ANC.
Take me into your confidence. What are your views? I'm keen to get into some of these private views.
Well, once I ventilate them in public, it would come across as, trying to influence the processes of nomination. So, as someone who sits in the electoral committee, the question you're posing to me, it's like asking the IEC whether, this or that political party contesting elections, has acted correctly or not. So, in my responsibility as part of the electoral committee, we have to be as detached and independent of processes of and views within the ANC, and focus on enforcing and implementing the rules that the NEC adopted.
You were very concerned as an organization about this issue of monies used for campaigns and needing greater accountability around that. You sent out rules at the beginning of November of how those that had been nominated, what they need to do in order to be accountable. What has been the process so far?
Well, we've sent out reminders to those who have, accepted nomination, that they should ensure that they, inform us of who their campaigners are, and also keep proper records of what monies were received from whichever donor, and how those monies were utilized. And since the rules allow for campaigning, however, they also stipulate that monies can only be used for securing a venue, and maybe a public address system, and water, and that no nominees or campaigners are allowed to offer any sweeteners or bribes, if you like, to members of the ANC. They are also not allowed to transport any group of ANC members or quarantine them, because some of the practices in the past were that delegates from certain, parts of the country would be transported and literally taken away from the rest of the other delegates.
Sure.
And I said to you, conference is a structure in itself, so all delegates have to intermingle and be together. So all of these things, according to the rules, are offenses which might lead to disqualification.
Much of these things have been happening off the books,
Yeah.
and they're spoken about, but unable to be traced down to individuals, times when money's exchanged hands.
Well,
what do you think that the introduction of this policy is going to do? I mean, it still doesn't give you eyes and ears on the ground to see what is happening between delegates.
Well, eyes and ears are the general membership, because the people who are going to be, offered bribes or sweeteners are the membership. And because these are the rules of the organization, we expect at least some members to say, I've been approached and I've been offered this money by so-and-so, and we'll disqualify them forthwith.
When you look at the nominations for the top 6, the female candidates have been confined to the position of Deputy Secretary General, and we know that there were a number that had raised their hands up for several other positions. Why do you think that there is such a big struggle around gender parity within the ANC?
Well, firstly, the principle of 50-50 gender representation applies. And here we're talking about the National Executive Committee, which is made up of 86 members. And the constitution of the ANC then says the election of the officials, national officials, which are some, in common parlance, they are referred to as the top 6, are to be elected separately from the additional members, which is the 80, because there's no structure in the ANC constitution called officials. They are the National Executive Committee. But the office bearers, so to speak, are elected separately from the additional 80 members to make up the total 86. And so the 50-50 parity rule applies to the 86. Out of the 86,
sure,
minimum 43 must be, female.
But surely it's not inconsequential. Sorry to interrupt there. It's not inconsequential, the fact that the top 6 structures, you have women nominated to just one position. But I'll give you a chance just to conclude.
I was going to...
Yes, I'll give you a chance to conclude.
I was going to
after this quick break.
Okay.
We'll continue with Kgalema Motlanthe. Well, we continue our conversation with the ANC's Electoral Committee head tonight, Kgalema Motlanthe. Mr. Motlanthe, you were talking us through the nominations, and particularly the nominations of women to the party's top 6 position, and why it is that you think that the party, as the ANC, is struggling with nominating women to positions beyond this DSG role.
Well, the rules that the NEC adopted, in those rules, we emphasized the need for the 50-50 gender parity rule to be applied to the top 6 in terms of nominations. We said branches should try and apply their minds and nominate and adhere to this 50-50 rule in relation to the top 6. We said so well aware that it's not in the constitution of the ANC. And there was a bit of resistance and pushback, but we insisted that this must apply, because if members, apply their minds properly, they would then realize that there's a need to create the parity. Of course, because it's nominations, so it's panned out now that once again, it's the position of deputy SG that has females. And the second point I want to make is that the elections themselves of officials are going to be in two parts. Firstly, there will be the election of the first four, that's President, Secretary General, Treasurer General, and National Chairperson. And the idea was that the delegates can then see whether the first four meet the requirements of, representativity in terms of demographics, in terms of, geographic spread, in terms of gender. So that if they are of the view that no, it doesn't, then they can utilize the second part to try and correct that. We hope that going forward, that recommendation may actually apply to the officials constitutionally, so that it becomes binding. We couldn't say this rule would be strictly adhered to, because it's nominations, and the manner in which these are, in other words, dispersed structures that whose views are then get consolidated.
But is that not in and of itself quite telling, that members on their own are not electing women to some of the leadership positions, and this is an organization where the majority of the membership are women?
Yes.
So what does that tell you about the organization, the state of the ANC, when it comes to representation, and in particular, gender representation?
Well, the sad part is that this is not just a women's issue. It also speaks to the consciousness of the male members of the ANC and their understanding and commitment to gender parity. But of course, it's compounded by the fact that the women structures don't themselves even nominate females. That's part of the complication to this problem. However, part of the rules in terms of this gender parity rule, the Electoral Committee and the NEC adopted that if the nominations of the 86 members from any province end up being, because we take 200 names, if out of the 200, a province nominates 140 males and 60 females, we only consider 60 males from that province and disregard the rest. Yeah.
So effectively, you're hoping to manage this issue in the NEC.
We are enforcing in the NEC.
Yes, but in the top six, difficult for you to do.
The top six, it is still difficult because it's not constitutional, because they are the NEC. You see, so that's part of what the rules were attempting to do, was to extend it to this top six.
Does that mean that the ANC remains largely a very patriarchal organization, as some of its critics have said, including some of the women in the Women's League and even those that have raised their hand?
Well, I've said that, you know, the general membership of the ANC, male and female, are not up to the commitment on gender parity. That's why it really takes the male members of the ANC to know how to nominate and support female candidates such that the female members of the ANC should also not deny support to fellow female comrades, as it were.
All right.
Yeah.
I'm going to end it off on a lighter note. Oh. I know you're quite a soccer enthusiast.
Yes.
Have you been watching the World Cup?
Yes, I have, you know, in between load shedding.
You also get load shed?
Yes, I do, yeah.
Who do you think is going to win?
It's too early to call now. But, you know, there are... you see, the first round is not a good indicator because some of them will peak when they get to the knockout section of the tournament. For now, teams that may end up, you know, losing to, you know, teams that are no-hopers will peak at the right. It just depends on, you know, whether they are able to sustain and maintain the same levels of form.
But who's your money on?
Well, for now, I support the African countries here. I'm hoping that they will go beyond the quarterfinals this round.
All right.
Yeah.
I imagine it's a good distraction from all the hard work that you have to do.
Well, yeah, if you like. That's why I didn't want to discuss ESCOM, because it interferes with that a great deal.
Well, it's great to hear that, you know, you go through the same suffering as everybody else in this country. And then, of course, Kgalema Motlanthe, the Electoral Committee head of the ANC.